Chapter 1. A World of Deceptions and Forgeries. Whenever I teach about forgery, I think back to my first lecture on the subject 25 years ago now at Luther's University. As old as this might seem, forgery was on everyone's mind at the time. Only a few months earlier, forgery had been front-page news for weeks in major newspapers around the world. The diaries of Adolf Hitler had been discovered, authenticated by one of the world's leading experts in the field. British historian Hugh Roper. The diaries had been purchased for millions of dollars, first by Stern magazine in Germany, then by Rupert Murdoch for English publishing rights. But just as they started to appear, they were shown to be worthless forgeries. The forger of the diaries was a West German named Konrad Kusau. Ironically, even before he perpetuated the biggest con job of modern times, his friends called him Connie. Kusau had grown up as a poor working-class fellow. At an early age, he discovered an artistic ability that led him to a career of forgery. He spent some time in jail as a young adult, having been caught forging lunch vouchers. But he had a number of aliases, and the people to whom he sold the Hitler diaries were not assiduous in making a background check. The Hitler diaries consisted of some 60 books of handwriting notes that Hitler himself had allegedly made during his time in power. From June 1932 to the very end of 1945, for collectors of Nazi memorabilia, such a discovery would be priceless. We have a number of documents and paintings that Hitler produced, but nothing like this. An account of his daily activities, encounters, successes, excesses, companions, loves, hates, and rumbling thoughts. When Stern had come into possession of the books and decided to publish them in 1984, the publishers consulted with Robert Roper, who, despite an initial suspicion that they must be a hoax, became convinced of the authenticity of the books upon a quick perusal of some of their pages. The documents looked old. They contained numerous pieces of accurate data, and lots of asides and irrelevances that one would expect in a personal diary. And there were so many of them. What forger would go to that much trouble? 그러니까 위조작품이겠지. Moreover, there was a plausible explanation for how they had managed to survive the war. It was well known that when defeat was imminent, Hitler had several metal boxes filled with his personal effects flown out of the Berlin. But the plane had been shot down and his pilot killed. Local villagers near the wreck site pillaged the plane, and the boxes ended up in private hands. Collectors of memorabilia later passed for the materials, and one such collector, named Konrad Fischer, an alias for Konrad Kusau, had ended up with the diaries. They had allegedly been smuggled out of the East by his brother, a general in the East German army. But in fact, it was all a hoax by Kusau himself, who had learned to imitate Hitler's handwriting, had read authoritative biographies of the Führer to get his facts more or less straight, and had painstakingly produced the accounts over a 3-year period in the early 1980s to make the pages look aged and worn. He blotted them with tea and repeatedly slapped them on the table.
진짜 웃긴 사람이네. 이렇게까지? 팔아먹으려고 했겠지 진짜. 사기치는 것도 진짜.
And he fooled the experts long enough at least to be paid $48 million for his efforts. 480만 달러에 팔아먹었다라. 몇 년도인지 모르겠는데 하여튼 뭐 비싸게 팔았네. 지금 가치로 환산하면 몇이냐? 1.4 한 70억 되나? 그 정도 되나 보다. 이때는 더 비쌌겠지. 지금은 배 가치가 아닌 게. They had before the diaries were to be released to the public. However, travel robbers started having second thoughts over the course of the next few days. After Stern had announced the most significant historical find in decades, other specialists were brought in. The diaries were shown beyond any doubt at all to be fakes. Forensics experts found that the paper, the glue, and the ink were all of post-1945 vintage. Post-1945 vintage. 그래서 알아냈나? It's trying to show that the diaries were filled with errors. Kuzo was convicted of forgery, a crime by modern standards, though, as we'll see, not by accident, ancient ones, and spent several years in prison. He emerged under unrepentant, however, and spent a good bit of the rest of his life painting forgeries of great art, imitations of Monet, Rembrandt, and Van Gogh, and selling them pricelessly as imitations. Precisely as imitations. This eventually created a market for other forgers to produce and sell replicas of Kuzel's imitations. As a climax to this seemingly never-ending story. 강세 틀리겠다. As a climax to this seemingly never-ending story. At the end of Kuzel's life, he produced an autobiography which was never published. Instead, a different book appeared in his name called Die Originalität der Fälschung. 영어로 하면 The Originality of Forgery. false가 거짓이니까 fälschung이 위작이 되는 거구나. Kuzel claimed, evidently in all truthfulness, that he had not written a word of it. 그래? 다른 사람 위작으로 썼구나 이것도. 결말까지 웃기네. 아이고야. Forgeries in the ancient world. When I give public lectures on forgery, I am often asked, who would do such a thing? The answer is lots of people, and for lots of different reasons. The most common reason today, of course, is to make money. Conrad Kuzel may be the most infamous and egregious case in point. With his many hundreds of lesser-known colleagues and disciples, the forgery trade continues to thrive. Forgers in the names of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Lord Byron, Robert Frost, and many others continue to flood the market, as recent literature on modern forgeries so aptly attests. These forgeries are almost always produced in order to be sold as authentic. 거의 항상 그렇게 위장 만드는 솜씨가 뛰어난가 보네. There was a good deal of that kind of activity in the ancient world as well. As far fewer forgery experts who could detect a forgery if they saw one, and far fewer forgery experts who could detect a forgery if they saw one. 그래. Although it was not a major factor within early Christianity. This was for a simple reason. Christian books were not, by and large, for sale. 그렇구나. 팔아먹으려고 위조하진 않았다는 거네. 돈 벌려고. 그럼 뭐 무슨 이유라고 해야 돼? 경제적인 이유, 재정적인 이유로 위조를 하진 않았다. 그럼 다른 이유로 위조했다고 하겠지. Other scoundrels today will occasionally forge documents just to see if they can get away with it. This too is something that occasionally happened in the ancient world. The most famous account is the well-known case of Dionysus the Renegade. Dionysus the Renegade?
이런 사람이 있나 보네.
Dionysus the Renegade.
누군지 전혀 모르는데. 스토아 철학자라고 그런 거 같은데.
디오니시우스 레니게이드는 스토아 철학자라고 그런 사람이 있구나. Dionysius was a literary scholar and philosopher of the 3rd century BCE. He eventually earned the epithet renegade because he had fallen out with his fellow Stoic philosophers when he came to realize that his philosophical views did not jibe with real life as he experienced it.
지배의식이라고 해야 돼? jibe with. 내가 바꾸네.
Jibe with real life as he experienced it. Stoics taught that people should remove themselves mentally and emotionally from the pain and anguish of this life to experience inner tranquility of spirit. Dionysius for a long time subscribed to this view. But then he became very ill, experienced a good deal of pain, and started to think that his earlier philosophizing about pain was bogus in the face of pain itself. So I love the Stoics and was called by them a renegade. What he is most famous for in the annals of history, however, 역사의 연대에서 중시되는 것은 is a ruse that he pulled on a fellow literary scholar, his former teacher but eventual opponent, Heraclitus of Pontus. 그래? The ruse involved debauchery. It was a pure satire produced to make Heraclitus look bad. Dionysius wrote and put in circulation a tragic play called the Parthenopaus, claiming that it was the work of the famous Greek dramatist Sophocles. The play made its way into the hands of Heraclitus, who had no reason to doubt its authenticity. Heraclitus eventually quoted it to illustrate the point about Sophocles. This is just what Dionysius was hoping for, a chance to show up his opponent. He triumphantly confronted Heraclitus and told him that the play was forged. In fact, he himself had written it. Heraclitus, however, did not believe it and insisted that Dionysius was lying. But Dionysius had an ace or two up his sleeve. He showed Heraclitus that if he took the first letter of his series of lines in the first part of the play and strung them together as an acrostic, they spelled the name Pancalus, which happened to be the name of Dionysius' male lover. Heraclitus was still not convinced, and so Dionysius showed him the other acrostics embedded in the lines of the text. The first formed a poetic couplet. An old monkey is not caught by a trap. Oh yes, he is caught at last. But it takes time. The other line was completely decisive. Heraclitus is ignorant, he blushes and is not ashamed of his ignorance. We find nothing quite so hilarious or outrageous in the writings of an early Christians. In fact, there is scant evidence to suggest that any Christian authors forged documents simply in order to see if they could get away with it. Even so, there were plenty of early Christian forgers who produced lots of forged documents, probably for lots of reasons. As I pointed out in the introduction, we still have numerous forged documents that emanated from the early church. Numerous Gospels, Acts, Latches, and Apocalypses. There are the four literary genres of the New Testament, all of them claiming to be written by apostles. Many of these non-canonical books are fascinating and still worth reading. Among the Gospels, for example, there is an account allegedly written by Peter that gives a detailed narration of the resurrection. This is striking because most readers have never noticed this. The New Testament Gospels do not narrate the resurrection. 아, 그래? 사복음서에 부활에 대한 내레이트가 없다고? 있지 않나? They do say that Jesus was buried and indicate that on the third day his tomb was empty, but they do not narrate the account of his actually emerging from the tomb. 아, 무덤이 비어 있었다고 암시되지는 단순히 사실을 설명한 거지 부활했다는 서사는 나중에 덧붙여줬다는 얘기구나. There is such an account in the Gospel of Peter, however. 베드로 복음이야?
베드로 전서 후서가 베드로 복음인가? 그 얘긴가 보지? 베드로의 복음서? 잠깐 베드로 전서 후서라는 게 있었나 본데? 아 이거 외전이구나. 내가 바보였구나.
하여튼 In it, Jesus walks out of the tomb supported by two angels who are as tall as mountains, although Jesus is taller still. Behind them, out of the tomb, emerges the cross, which speaks out to God in heaven. Other apostolic gospels tell yet other amazing stories about Jesus or record bizarre teachings supposedly spoken by him. Gospels allegedly written by Jesus' brother Thomas, his disciple Philip, and his female companion Mary Magdalene. All of these books claim to be authentic, but each of them was classified as a forgery by other early Christians who did not believe the apostles had actually written them. There are also non-canonical acts, books that narrate the adventures of Jesus' apostles after his ascension, such as the Acts of Paul, in which Paul preaches that to have eternal life, followers of Jesus must refrain from sex even if married, 진짜로? And avoid marriage altogether if single.
곧 승천해야 되니까 결혼하지 말라는 소린가 보네. 이 종말론자들, 말세론자들.
This book was fabricated by a church leader in Asia Minor in the 2nd century. We know about it because a famous church father, Tertullian, indicates that the person was caught and put on trial in the church for producing the account and then unceremoniously removed from his leadership position. Most church leaders did not appreciate fabricated documents. Did not appreciate fabricated documents. But there were plenty to go around. Today we still have extensive copies of Acts of John, Peter, Andrew, and Thomas, as well as fragments of early works that no longer survive intact.
그러면 이제 사도행전이 아니라고 Acts of John, 요한행전, 베드로행전, 앤드류는 누군지 모르겠는데 앤드류가 누구지 한국말로? 그 다음에 도마행전이 있고 앤드류의 사도라고 치면 나오겠지. 안드레아. 그렇구나.
There are also forged letters including a set of letters between Paul and the most famous philosopher of his day, Seneca, which showed not only that Paul was on intimate terms with the greatest minds of the empire, but also that he was respected and revered by them. Some later church leaders maintained that these letters were authentic, but others thought they had been forged for the purpose of making Paul look good. There were also debates over the authenticity of other letters of Paul and Peter, and even of Jesus. Some of these writings still survive. Some of these other writings still survive.